Elena Martinez stood in the doorway of her grandmother's Victorian house, keys heavy in her palm. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the tall windows, making the dust particles dance in the air like tiny spirits. She had not been inside this house for over 10 years, not since she was 18 and angry at the world. Her grandmother Rosa had passed away 3 weeks ago, leaving Elena this sprawling house in the historic district of Salem, Oregon. The lawyer had been surprised when he read the will. Elena was the sole heir, despite the fact that she had barely spoken to her grandmother in the past decade. The family rift had started when Elena decided to study journalism instead of taking over the family's small restaurant. Rosa had called her ungrateful. Elena had called her grandmother old-fashioned. Neither had apologized. Now, walking through the familiar rooms, Elena felt the weight of missed opportunities. The house smelled of lavender and old books, exactly as she remembered. Rosa's reading glasses still sat on the kitchen table next to a half-finished crossword puzzle. Her favorite shawl hung over the back of her rocking chair. It was as if she had just stepped out for groceries and would return any moment. Elena had taken a week off from her job at the Portland Tribune to sort through her grandmother's belongings. She planned to sell the house and return to her busy life in the city. But as she moved from room to room, memories began flooding back. Summer afternoons spent in the garden, learning to cook empanadas in the kitchen, listening to Rosa's stories about their family's journey from Mexico to Oregon in the 1940s. The second floor held her grandmother's bedroom and 2 guest rooms that had been converted to storage. Elena started there, methodically going through boxes of old photographs, documents, and mementos. Her grandmother had kept everything: report cards from Elena's elementary school, newspaper clippings about the restaurant's anniversary, even ticket stubs from movies they had seen together. In one box, Elena found photographs she had never seen before. Pictures of Rosa as a young woman, beautiful and smiling, standing next to a man Elena didn't recognize. He was tall and dark-haired, wearing a military uniform. In several photos, they looked deeply in love, holding hands and gazing into each other's eyes. Elena had always assumed her grandmother had only loved her grandfather, Miguel, but Miguel was short and stocky with light brown hair. This man was completely different. She studied the photos more carefully. On the back of one, in Rosa's careful handwriting, were the words, "David and me, 1943. Elena had never heard Rosa mention anyone named David. She searched through more boxes but found no other references to this mysterious man. As evening approached, Elena decided to tackle the basement. The wooden stairs creaked under her weight as she descended into the musty darkness. She pulled the chain for the overhead light, and a bare bulb illuminated the cluttered space. Old furniture, holiday decorations, and more boxes filled the room. But something caught her eye. In the far corner, partially hidden behind a tall bookshelf, was what looked like a door. Elena pushed the bookshelf aside, grunting with effort. Behind it was indeed a door, painted the same color as the basement walls, making it almost invisible. There was no handle, just a small keyhole. Her heart began racing as she examined it more closely. Why would her grandmother hide a door? And why had she never mentioned this room? She ran upstairs to get a flashlight and the box of old keys she had found in Rosa's desk drawer. Back in the basement, she tried key after key until one finally turned. The lock clicked open and the door swung inward with a groan that suggested it hadn't been opened in years. Elena shined her flashlight into the darkness and gasped. The beam revealed a small room, perhaps 8 feet by 10 feet, with no windows. Against one wall was a wooden desk and chair. Against another was a narrow bed with faded linens. But what made Elena's breath catch were the walls themselves. Every inch was covered with photographs, newspaper clippings, and handwritten notes. Maps of Oregon and California were pinned next to train schedules from the 1940s. There were more pictures of the mysterious David, some alone, some with Rosa. But there were also photographs of other people Elena didn't recognize, men and women of various ages, all with what looked like identification numbers pinned to their clothing. Elena stepped into the room, her flashlight beam moving across the walls. The newspaper clippings were yellowed with age, but she could make out headlines about World War II, stories about Japanese-American internment camps, articles about the Bracero program that brought Mexican workers to American farms. Her grandmother's careful handwriting filled notebooks that were stacked on the desk. In the center of one wall was a large map of the United States with red strings connecting various locations. Cities in California, Oregon, Washington, and Arizona were marked with red pins. Some locations were circled in pencil with numbers written beside them. Elena picked up one of the notebooks from the desk and opened it. The first page was dated September 15, 1943, and written in Spanish. Elena's Spanish was rusty, but she could understand enough to realize these were not just her grandmother's personal diary entries. These were detailed records of names, dates, and locations, lists of people with descriptions of where they had gone and when. She flipped through more pages, finding similar entries spanning several years from 1943 to 1947. Some entries were in Spanish, others in English. Rosa had written about hiding places, safe routes, money collected and distributed, meetings with people identified only by initials or code names. Elena sank into the wooden chair, trying to process what she was seeing. Her grandmother, the woman she had known as a simple restaurant owner who made the best tamales in town, had apparently been involved in something much more complex and dangerous during the 1940s. The room felt like a command center for some kind of underground operation. She examined more of the photographs pinned to the walls. Many showed groups of people standing in front of trains or buses, clutching suitcases and looking tired but hopeful. Children held tightly to their parents' hands. Elderly people sat on benches with weary expressions. These weren't vacation photos or family gatherings. These people looked like they were running from something. Or someone. In one corner of the room, Elena found a metal box hidden under the narrow bed. Inside were documents that made her hands shake as she read them. False identity papers with Rosa's photograph but different names. Letters written in code, and strangest of all, a bundle of money, old bills from the 1940s, tied with a rubber band that crumbled when she touched it. But it was the last item in the box that made Elena sink back into the chair in shock. It was a death certificate, dated August 12, 1944, with David Morrison's name written in official script. The cause of death was listed as killed in action in the Philippines. Below that, in Rosa's handwriting, were the words, "They told me he was dead, but I knew better. I found him in the camp near Manzanar. I had to choose between saving him and saving the others. God forgive me. I chose the others." Elena sat in the hidden room as darkness fell outside, surrounded by evidence of a life her grandmother had never shared. The woman she thought she knew had apparently risked everything to help people during one of the darkest periods in American history. And somewhere in this puzzle was David Morrison, a man who was supposed to be dead, but whom Rosa had found alive in an internment camp. She looked again at the map on the wall, studying the red strings that connected different cities. Each pin seemed to represent a stop on some kind of underground railroad, a network that had helped people escape or hide during the war. Rosa hadn't just been a bystander to history. She had been an active participant in something dangerous and illegal. Elena realized she could no longer simply sell the house and return to Portland. She needed to understand what her grandmother had been involved in, who David Morrison really was, and why Rosa had kept this secret for over 70 years. As she carefully gathered some of the notebooks and photographs to study upstairs, Elena felt as though she was seeing her family's history for the first time. The grandmother she had argued with about tradition and the American dream had actually risked her life to help others achieve that dream. Rosa had been a hero, and Elena had never known it. But why the secrecy? And what had happened to David Morrison after Rosa found him in the camp? The answers were somewhere in this room, waiting to rewrite everything Elena thought she knew about her family. Elena spent the next morning in Rosa's kitchen, surrounded by notebooks, photographs, and documents from the hidden room. She had made strong coffee and spread everything across the wooden table, trying to piece together her grandmother's secret life. The morning light made the faded ink easier to read, and Elena was beginning to understand the scope of what Rosa had been involved in. The notebooks revealed a sophisticated network of people helping Japanese Americans escape illegal detention and Mexican workers avoid deportation during and after World War II. Rosa had been one of many coordinators, using code names and secret meeting places to move people safely from one location to another. The red strings on the map corresponded to routes that stretched from California internment camps to safe houses in Oregon, Washington, and even Canada. Elena found references to something called Operation Sunrise, which appeared to be the code name for the entire network. Rosa's role had been significant. She arranged safe houses, provided false documents, and coordinated with sympathizers in law enforcement and government offices who looked the other way when trains carried more passengers than official records showed. But it was David Morrison who remained the biggest mystery. Elena found more references to him scattered throughout the notebooks. He hadn't just been Rosa's boyfriend. According to the entries, David had been the network's inside connection, a military intelligence officer who provided advance warning about government raids and helped forge official documents. Elena discovered that David Morrison had indeed been reported killed in action in the Philippines in 1944. But Rosa's notes suggested this was a carefully constructed lie. Someone in the military had helped fake his death so he could work undercover to help the resistance network. Rosa had written, "David came back from the dead today. He says it's the only way to save them. They'll never suspect a dead man of treason." The entry that had mentioned finding David in an internment camp near Manzanar was more complex than Elena had first understood. David hadn't been imprisoned there. He had been working undercover inside the camp, gathering intelligence about planned transfers of prisoners to different locations. Rosa had gone to warn him that his cover had been blown and government investigators were coming for him. Elena put down the notebook and walked to the window, looking out at her grandmother's carefully tended garden. Rose bushes climbed a wooden trellis, and vegetables grew in neat rows. It was hard to imagine this peaceful place as the headquarters for such dangerous activities. She returned to the table and picked up a bundle of letters tied with a faded blue ribbon. They were love letters between Rosa and David, written in a mixture of English and Spanish. Reading them felt like intruding on something private, but Elena needed to understand their relationship to piece together the larger story. The letters revealed a passionate love affair, complicated by the dangers of their work. David wrote about the guilt he felt, watching innocent families torn apart by government policies. Rosa wrote about the fear she lived with every day, knowing that discovery would mean prison for her entire family. They had planned to marry after the war, to start fresh in a place where no one knew their secret history. But something had gone wrong. The last letter from David was dated December 10th, 1947, and it was different from the others. Instead of declarations of love, it was full of warnings and apologies. He wrote that he had been discovered by federal agents and needed to disappear permanently. He begged Rosa to destroy all evidence of Operation Sunrise and to forget him for her own safety. The letter ended with the words, "I love you enough to leave you. Please don't look for me. If they find you, it will destroy everything we worked for." Elena realized this explained why Rosa had sealed the room and hidden all evidence of her wartime activities. She had followed David's instructions to protect herself and the other members of their network. But she had been unable to destroy the memories, so she had preserved them in secret instead. Elena decided she needed to research David Morrison more thoroughly. She drove to the Salem Public Library and spent hours searching through newspaper archives and military records. What she found confirmed Rosa's story. Lieutenant David Morrison had officially died in combat in the Philippines in August 1944. There were no records of him after that date. But Elena also found something else. In a 1963 newspaper article about local business owners, there was a small photograph of a man identified as David Moreno, owner of a successful construction company in Eugene, Oregon. The man looked remarkably similar to the David in Rosa's photographs, just 20 years older. Elena's hands trembled as she printed the article. Eugene was only an hour's drive from Salem. If this was the same man, he had been living less than 60 miles from Rosa for decades, using a slightly altered name and a completely new identity. She drove to Eugene that same afternoon, her mind racing with questions. Would David still be alive? Would he remember Rosa? Did he know she had kept his secret all these years? The construction company was no longer in business, but Elena found the address in old phone directories. She drove through a middle-class neighborhood until she found the house that had been listed as David Moreno's residence. It was a modest ranch-style home with a well-maintained yard and a "for sale" sign on the front lawn. Elena knocked on the door, unsure what she would say if someone answered. An elderly woman opened the door and looked at Elena curiously. "I'm sorry to bother you," Elena began, "but I'm looking for information about someone who used to live here. David Moreno?" The woman's face brightened. "Oh, you knew David. He was such a wonderful man. I'm his daughter, Maria. We're selling Dad's house because he passed away 6 months ago." Elena's heart sank, but she pressed on. "I'm so sorry for your loss. I'm researching someone who might have known your father during the 1940s. My grandmother, Rosa Martinez." Maria's expression changed completely. She stepped outside and closed the door behind her, looking around nervously. "How do you know that name? Dad made me promise never to talk about anyone from that time. Rosa was my grandmother. She passed away recently, and I found some things in her house. I think your father and my grandmother were involved in helping people during the war." Maria studied Elena's face carefully. "You look like her," she said finally. "Dad had a photograph of a young woman he kept hidden in his workshop. When I was little, I asked him who she was, and he said she was the bravest person he'd ever known. He called her his angel." Elena felt tears forming in her eyes. "Did he ever try to contact her?" "He wanted to, especially after Mom died in 1995. But he was terrified that it would put her in danger. He said there were still people in the government who would prosecute them if they knew the truth about what they had done. He carried that fear his whole life." Maria invited Elena inside, and they spent the next 2 hours going through David's belongings. In his workshop, Elena found another hidden room, smaller than Rosa's but filled with similar evidence. Maps, photographs, and documents that confirmed everything Elena had learned about Operation Sunrise. But Maria also showed Elena something that took her breath away. It was a letter David had written but never sent, addressed to Rosa Martinez in Salem, Oregon. It was dated just 3 months before he died. "My dearest Rosa," the letter began, "not a day has passed in 60 years that I haven't thought about you. I hope you found happiness and love after I left. I hope you had children and grandchildren who got to know the remarkable woman you are. I kept our secret to keep you safe. But now that I'm dying, I want you to know that leaving you was the hardest thing I ever did. You saved hundreds of lives, and you saved my soul. I love you still." Elena sat in David's workshop, holding the letter he had been too afraid to send. Two people who had loved each other deeply had spent their entire lives apart, each protecting the other by maintaining their silence. Rosa had died, never knowing that David had spent 60 years thinking about her every day. Maria explained that David had built a successful life in Eugene. He had married a kind woman named Carmen in 1952 and raised 3 children. He had been a good husband and father, active in his community and church. But Maria said he had always seemed to carry a sadness that he could never quite explain. He used to sit in his workshop for hours, Maria told Elena, especially on Christmas Eve and Rosa's birthday. I never understood why those dates were special until I found his calendar after he died. He had marked the same dates every year for 60 years. Elena asked how David had known Rosa's birthday, and Maria showed her another hidden compartment in David's desk. Inside was a single newspaper clipping from 1963 announcing the 5th anniversary of Rosa's restaurant. The article mentioned that Rosa Martinez had opened the restaurant on her 40th birthday. Dad kept track of her through newspaper articles and public records, Maria explained. He knew when she opened the restaurant, when it celebrated milestones, even when your parents got married because it was announced in the local paper. He followed your whole family from a distance, but he never dared make contact. Elena realized that both Rosa and David had lived parallel lives, loving each other from afar, but never allowing themselves to reconnect. Their sacrifice had been enormous, but Elena wondered if it had been necessary. By the 1960s and 1970s, would anyone have really cared about their wartime activities? Maria walked Elena to her car as the sun set behind the hills. I think Dad would be happy to know that someone finally understands what he and Rosa did, she said. They were heroes, but they never got to be recognized for it. Elena drove back to Salem with David's unsent letter in her purse. She had solved the mystery of David Morrison, but the discovery brought more sadness than satisfaction. 2 people had sacrificed their happiness to protect each other and the secret of their heroic actions. They had died within months of each other, never knowing how much the other had continued to care. As Elena pulled into Rosa's driveway, she made a decision. The hidden room had kept their secrets for 70 years, but Elena would not let their story remain buried forever. She would find a way to honor their memory and the lives they had saved, even if she had to be careful about how she told their story. Elena spent her final week in Salem making copies of everything she had found in both hidden rooms. She carefully photographed each document, scanned the notebooks, and digitized hundreds of photographs. The story of Operation Sunrise was too important to remain buried, but she knew she needed to be careful about how she shared it. She reached out to Dr. Patricia Yamamoto, a historian at Portland State University who specialized in Japanese-American internment history. Elena met her at a coffee shop near the university, bringing only copies of a few photographs and documents as samples. Dr. Yamamoto's eyes widened as she examined the materials. These are extraordinary, she said, adjusting her glasses to study Rosa's handwritten notes. We've heard rumors about underground networks that helped people escape the camps, but we've never found concrete evidence. Most participants took their secrets to their graves. That's exactly what my grandmother did, Elena replied. I only found this because I inherited her house. Dr. Yamamoto explained that Elena's discovery could revolutionize understanding of resistance to internment policies. The official narrative has always been that Japanese Americans went quietly to the camps and waited for the war to end, but these documents proved that there was organized resistance and that Mexican Americans and others risked their lives to help. Elena shared more details about Rosa and David's network, explaining their methods and the scope of their operations. Dr. Yamamoto was particularly interested in the false documents and the military connections that had made Operation Sunrise possible. This could be material for a book, Dr. Yamamoto said, or at minimum, a scholarly article that honors their memory while documenting this hidden history. Elena liked the idea of a book, but she wanted to make sure it would be accessible to general readers, not just academics. She had studied journalism specifically to tell important stories that might otherwise be forgotten. This seemed like the most important story she would ever have the chance to tell. She also contacted Maria Moreno, David's daughter, who was enthusiastic about the project. "Dad always said someone should write about what they did," Maria told Elena during a phone call. "He was proud of the work but frustrated that history books made it seem like no one fought back." Maria agreed to share David's documents and photographs for the book project. She also provided contact information for two other elderly people in Eugene who had known about David's wartime activities. Elena arranged interviews with both of them, adding their memories to her growing collection of evidence. One of them, an 87-year-old man named Frank Nakamura, had been a child when Operation Sunrise helped his family escape from a camp in California. "Your grandmother and that man David, they saved my whole family," he told Elena. "We were scheduled to be transferred to a camp in Arkansas, which would have separated me from my older brother. Rosa arranged for us to get off the train in Oregon instead. We lived in her restaurant's back room for 3 months while David got us new papers." Elena asked Frank if he would be willing to be interviewed for her book, and he agreed immediately. "I'm 90 years old," he said. "If I don't tell this story now, who will?" Elena spent the next several months conducting interviews, researching historical context, and organizing the materials she had found. She took a leave of absence from the Tribune to focus on the book project. Her editor was supportive, especially when Elena explained the historical significance of what she had discovered. The more she learned, the more impressed Elena became with the risks Rosa and David had taken. During the 1940s, helping people escape government detention could have resulted in decades in federal prison. The couples and families Elena interviewed described Rosa as fearless, someone who never hesitated to help despite the danger. One woman, now in her 80s, remembered Rosa bringing food and medicine to families hiding in farm worker camps outside Salem. "She always said that staying silent in the face of injustice was the same as participating in it," the woman recalled. "Rosa never stayed silent about anything." Elena realized this was the source of her own determination to pursue stories that revealed uncomfortable truths. She had inherited more than just Rosa's house. She had inherited her grandmother's belief that some stories were too important to leave untold, even when telling them was dangerous or difficult. As Elena worked on the book, she also had to decide what to do with Rosa's house. She had originally planned to sell it, but now that seemed impossible. The hidden room was a historical site that deserved preservation. Elena decided to donate the house to the Oregon Historical Society, with the stipulation that the hidden room be maintained exactly as Rosa had left it. The Historical Society was thrilled to accept the donation. They planned to eventually offer tours of the room as part of an exhibit about resistance activities during World War II. Elena would be able to visit whenever she wanted, but the responsibility for maintaining Rosa's legacy would be shared with people who understood its historical importance. Elena also made another decision that surprised even herself. She decided not to return to Portland. Instead, she took a job with the Salem Statesman Journal, the local newspaper. She wanted to be closer to the community where Rosa had lived and worked. She also wanted to continue researching other stories about unsung heroes in Oregon's history. 6 months later, Elena stood in Rosa's former living room, now transformed into a museum space. The Hidden Heroes of Oregon exhibit was opening to the public for the first time, and Elena had been invited to speak at the ceremony. Representatives from Japanese-American community organizations had come from across the Pacific Northwest. Descendants of other Operation Sunrise participants had traveled from California, Washington, and Arizona. Dr. Yamamoto introduced Elena to the crowd gathered in the living room. "Elena Martinez didn't just inherit this house," she said. "She inherited a responsibility to share a story that had been hidden for 70 years. Thanks to her courage and dedication, we now understand that resistance to injustice took many forms during one of the darkest periods in American history." Elena looked around at the faces in the audience. Many were elderly people who had been children when Operation Sunrise helped their families. Others were young people learning this history for the first time. Frank Nakamura was there, accompanied by 3 generations of his family. When Elena spoke, she talked about the lesson Rosa and David had taught her about sacrifice and love. My grandmother and David Morrison chose to help others, even when it meant giving up their own happiness, she said. They chose to risk everything for strangers because they believed it was the right thing to do. They never expected recognition or rewards. They just saw people who needed help, and they helped. Elena also talked about the importance of preserving difficult histories. These stories matter because they remind us that ordinary people are capable of extraordinary courage, she said. Rosa was a restaurant owner. David was a soldier. They weren't famous or powerful, but they changed history by refusing to accept injustice as inevitable. After the ceremony, Maria Moreno approached Elena with tears in her eyes. "Dad would be so proud," she said. "He always worried that their story would die with them." Elena showed Maria and other family members through the exhibit, explaining each display and sharing stories from her research. In the hidden room, now carefully preserved behind protective glass, visitors could see Rosa's map with its red strings, her carefully written notebooks, and photographs of the people Operation Sunrise had helped. But the centerpiece of the exhibit was something new. Elena had worked with a local artist to create a memorial wall listing the names of everyone Rosa and David had helped, based on the records in their notebooks. More than 300 names were engraved in black granite, representing lives that had been saved or changed by their courage. At the bottom of the memorial wall was a quote Elena had found in one of Rosa's final diary entries. "History will judge us not by what we said, but by what we did when others needed help and no one was watching." Elena had also arranged for David's unsent letter to Rosa to be displayed near a photograph of the 2 of them taken in 1943. Visitors could read David's words of enduring love and understand the personal cost of the choices they had made. As the evening wound down and the last visitors left the exhibit, Elena stood alone in the hidden room. She thought about the conversation she had never been able to have with Rosa, the apologies they had never exchanged, the understanding they had never reached. But she also felt closer to her grandmother than ever before. Elena now understood that Rosa's insistence on tradition and community had come from her experience helping people who had lost everything. Rosa's dedication to the restaurant had been about more than just business. It had been about creating a safe space where people could gather and feel welcomed, just as she had done during the war. Elena pulled out her phone and called her mother in Phoenix, something she had been meaning to do for weeks. When her mother answered, Elena said, "I need to tell you about Grandma Rosa. There's so much we didn't know about her." As Elena shared the story she had uncovered, she could hear her mother crying on the other end of the line. "I always wondered why she was so secretive about the war years," her mother said. She would change the subject whenever anyone asked about that time. Elena promised to bring copies of everything to Phoenix so her mother could see the evidence for herself. She also invited her mother to visit the exhibit when she felt ready. Before leaving the house that night, Elena walked through each room one final time. The living room where Rosa had entertained guests now told the story of Operation Sunrise. The kitchen where they had cooked together now displayed information about the restaurant that had served as a cover for resistance activities. The basement that had hidden so many secrets now welcomed visitors who wanted to understand this hidden chapter of history. Elena locked the front door and walked to her car, looking back at the Victorian house that had changed her life. She had come to Salem planning to sell property and return to her old life. Instead, she had discovered a new purpose and a deeper understanding of her family's legacy. Her book about Operation Sunrise would be published next year, with all proceeds going to organizations that support refugees and immigrants. Elena had decided this was what Rosa and David would have wanted. They had risked their lives to help people seeking safety and opportunity. The best way to honor their memory was to continue that work, in whatever way possible. As Elena drove through Salem's quiet streets toward her new apartment, she thought about the red strings on Rosa's map, connecting cities and safe houses across the American West. Those strings had represented hope and courage in the face of injustice. Now they connected Elena to a legacy she was proud to continue, one story at a time.